Imagine a river running through the rugged Balkan hills, its waters dark and restless, whispering stories of forgotten villages and nameless children. On its banks, centuries later, an elegant stone bridge would rise, arching across the Drina with perfect symmetry, its pale limestone glowing in the sun. Travelers would marvel at its beauty, merchants would cross it with their caravans, and poets would write of its endurance. Yet behind its silent stones lies a paradox. Was it built as a triumph of empire, or as a monument to a boy who once lost everything to that very empire? The bridge endures. The child who inspired it was taken, erased, remade. And in this paradox begins the story of Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, the Christian child from the village of Sokol, who became the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, the man who would hold the empire together as it reached both its zenith and its decline. But his story is not his alone. It is also the story of a woman, Ismihan Sultan, daughter of the dynasty itself, who would transform his life from that of a servant into that of a man bound by blood to the house of Osman. Without her, he might have remained a powerful minister. With her, he became something both greater and more vulnerable. Their fates would intertwine like the arches of that bridge, rising high, casting shadows, destined to endure and to crack. He was born around 1505 in the mountainous lands of Bosnia, in a small village whose name barely survives in memory. Sokolovici, meaning falcons. It was a Christian household, modest, with deep ties to the Orthodox Church. His family could not have known that one day their child would become the most powerful man in the empire that ruled them. For in those days, the Ottomans operated the Devshirme, the system that reached deep into the Christian provinces of the Balkans, taking boys away from their families, converting them to Islam, and training them for service in the empire. The practice was feared, hated, and yet paradoxically admired, for those chosen could rise to heights unimaginable in their native villages. The young boy of Sokolovici, like many before him, was taken from his parents, marched away under the watch of soldiers, and brought to Istanbul. His childhood ended in silence, with the echo of his mother's cries behind him and the horizon of empire before him. In the Ottoman capital, he entered the Enderun, the palace school that transformed Christian boys into Muslim men of state. The Enderun was not merely a place of education. It was a crucible of loyalty and discipline, where boys were trained in languages, law, military tactics, administration, and the arts of empire. They were taught to forget their past and embrace their new identity. The boy of Sokolovici became Mehmed. His surname, Sokollu, forever tied him to the memory of the village he had lost, but his identity was now Ottoman. To survive in this world, he had to excel, and excel he did. Tall, disciplined, and intelligent, Mehmed quickly gained the attention of his instructors. He absorbed languages, Turkish, Persian, Arabic, until he could recite poetry and legal codes alike. He studied the art of strategy and the delicate politics of the court. More than that, he learned the silent arts of survival, when to speak, when to remain silent, how to win favor without arrogance, how to carry himself in the presence of power. By his 20s, he was already serving as an officer in the palace, and soon he would command ships as Kapitan Pasha, admiral of the empire's fleet. Yet behind his rise, there was always a quiet tension. He was not Ottoman by blood. He was not of the house of Osman, nor of the great Turkish families. He was a Balkan outsider, lifted by talent, but forever needing to prove his loyalty. The empire offered him everything: education, power, wealth, but at the price of erasure. And deep within, though he rarely showed it, the boy who had once stood on the banks of the Drina remained. It was under Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent that Mehmed's career ascended rapidly. Süleyman valued competence, and Mehmed had it in abundance. He commanded fleets in the Mediterranean, he governed Rumelia, he negotiated with foreign ambassadors, and he built a reputation as a man who could be trusted to manage the complex machinery of empire. By the 1560s, he had become one of the viziers of the empire, a man whose words could shape policy and whose pen could alter the fate of provinces. But power in the Ottoman world was never secure. The palace was a theater of rivalry, where viziers rose and fell with dizzying speed. To endure, one needed allies not only in the divan, the council chamber, but also in the hidden corridors of the harem. For it was within the harem that the dynasty's future was shaped, where mothers and daughters of sultans wielded influence, where whispers could topple ministers, and where marriages could secure or destroy legacies. It was here that fate guided Sokollu Mehmed to the woman who would change his life, Ismihan Sultan. She was no ordinary woman. She was the daughter of Selim, the heir to the throne, and the granddaughter of the greatest imperial couple in Ottoman memory, Süleyman the Magnificent and Hürrem Sultan. Her blood carried legitimacy, her name commanded respect, and her presence in any alliance could elevate or crush a man's fortune. For Sokollu, marrying her was not only a step into the dynasty, but also an answer to the question that had haunted him since childhood. Could an outsider truly belong? Their union would not come immediately, nor without controversy. For a vizier, even a powerful one, to marry into the imperial family was extraordinary, almost unthinkable. The Ottomans jealously guarded the bloodline of the dynasty, and daughters of sultans were often married to princes of the empire or used to cement alliances with loyal households. That Sokollu, the Balkan-born vizier, should marry Ismihan was proof of how indispensable he had become. The empire needed him. Selim, the heir, recognized his loyalty and his brilliance, and so in 1562, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha wed Ismihan Sultan. The marriage bound him to the House of Osman in a way no office ever could. He was no longer merely the empire's servant, he was family. Ismihan, intelligent and aware of her place, understood the significance of this union. She was not a passive bride, but an active participant in shaping the politics of her time. In her husband, she saw a man who carried both the scars of loss and the brilliance of survival. In her, he found legitimacy, stability, and perhaps something even rarer in the cold corridors of power, companionship. This was not a love story in the romantic sense that modern audiences might imagine, though there was affection and respect. It was a partnership forged in the furnace of empire, where personal emotion intertwined with political necessity. Together they became a symbol, the outsider who had risen beyond all expectation, and the princess who had chosen to bind her fate to his. Their marriage was whispered about in the court, some admiring, some resentful, but all recognizing that it was a turning point. From this moment, Sokollu's career would no longer be measured only by his own abilities, but by the bond he shared with Ismihan. He had entered the dynasty not by birth, but by marriage, and in doing so he had both secured his future and exposed himself to greater dangers. The stakes had risen. Every decision he made, every success or failure would reflect not only on him, but also on the family he had joined. And so the boy from the Drina, who had once been taken from his family against his will, now stood at the heart of the Ottoman world, bound by love and politics to the most powerful dynasty on earth. His rise seemed unstoppable. Yet in the Ottoman Empire, as in all empires, the higher one rose, the more precarious the ground beneath one's feet became. As the 1560s drew to a close, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha was poised to become the Grand Vizier, the empire's first minister, the man upon whom the Sultan himself would rely. His talents were undeniable. His marriage to Ismihan cemented his place, and his reputation made him indispensable. But destiny, as always, had more trials in store. For empires do not endure on loyalty alone, and marriages, however strategic, cannot shield a man from the envy of rivals or the weight of history. Sokollu and Ismihan were bound together, but their union would soon be tested by secrets, wars, and betrayals that no bond could completely withstand. The bridge had been built, but rivers, as history always reminds us, are restless. The year was 1562, and in the marble corridors of the Topkapi Palace, a quiet but extraordinary decision was being prepared. The daughter of a prince, granddaughter of the most celebrated imperial couple in Ottoman memory, was to be given in marriage not to a fellow royal, not to a powerful bey from Anatolia or a loyal frontier commander, but to a man born far from the dynasty's bloodline. Ismihan Sultan, daughter of Selim, would be joined to Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, the Balkan-born vizier whose rise had astonished all who had witnessed it. The union was more than a marriage. It was a statement to the empire that an outsider could be absorbed into the dynasty itself, so long as he had proven indispensable. It was a union that spoke to the fragility of succession, to the careful calculations of politics, and to the vulnerabilities of a court where alliances meant survival. Ismihan Sultan had grown up in the harem, a world often misunderstood by those outside its gilded walls. To the casual observer, the harem might appear as a prison of women, but to those who lived within, it was a center of influence, a school of diplomacy, and a crucible of power. Here, the daughters of the Sultan were raised to understand their worth, their role, and the weight of their lineage. Ismihan was the granddaughter of Süleyman the Magnificent and Hürrem Sultan, whose names carried authority even in distant lands. She inherited not only their blood, but also their sense of destiny. From childhood, she had been taught that her life would never belong fully to her. Every step she took would serve the dynasty. Every marriage arranged would secure the empire. And yet, in her eyes, the choice of husband mattered deeply. For in the Ottoman world, a princess could be both a gift and a weapon, and the man chosen to receive her hand would either rise or fall with the weight of her name. For Sokollu Mehmed, this marriage was both a blessing and a burden. Until now, he had been a servant of the empire, a loyal vizier who owed his rise to his discipline, intelligence, and the trust of Süleyman. But marriage into the dynasty meant something far greater. He would no longer be merely a servant, he would become family. The outsider from Bosnia, once taken from his village as a child, would now share his life with the daughter of the heir apparent. It was an elevation few men could dream of, and yet it placed him in the most dangerous position of all. For to be married to a sultan's daughter was to walk a tightrope between loyalty and ambition, between being seen as indispensable and being resented as presumptuous. The wedding itself was celebrated with grandeur. Processions of silk, music from imperial musicians, fountains flowing with sherbet, and the blessings of imams marked the occasion. But beneath the spectacle, whispers ran through the palace. Some courtiers murmured that the empire was giving too much to a man who was not of Ottoman blood. Others admitted, reluctantly, that Sokollu had earned this honor through years of flawless service. Ismihan walked into the marriage with her head high, aware of the judgment in the eyes of others, but also aware of the role she was destined to play. She was no passive pawn. She was the living symbol of the dynasty's continuity, and she understood that her husband's fate would be bound to hers. Life after the marriage drew Sokollu and Ismihan into a delicate partnership. For Sokollu, the marriage legitimized his position in a way no appointment or title could. As the son-in-law of Selim, he was now shielded from the sudden dismissals that so often plagued viziers. His voice carried new authority, not only in the divan, but also in the palace's inner chambers. Yet this newfound security came at a cost. Every decision he made was now under sharper scrutiny, for he was no longer simply serving the empire, he was serving his family. For Ismihan, the marriage opened a path of influence unlike that of many other princesses. Where most women of the dynasty were married to secure loyalty from provincial governors, she remained at the heart of the capital, sharing her life with the man who would soon become Grand Vizier. She became his confidant, his sounding board, his partner in both private and political matters. Within the harem, she was respected for her intelligence and her ability to navigate its rivalries. Beyond its walls, she became a silent force in Sokollu's rise. Together, they represented something new in the Ottoman Empire. Their union was not a traditional dynastic marriage, nor was it a simple personal bond. It was a fusion of outsider ambition and imperial bloodline, a partnership that embodied both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of the empire itself. Sokollu brought the discipline and vision of one who had clawed his way upward from nothing. Ismihan brought the legitimacy and weight of the dynasty. Together, they were stronger than either could be alone. Yet the world beyond their marriage was shifting. Sultan Süleyman, though still formidable, was nearing the end of his reign. The question of succession loomed heavily over the empire. Selim, Ismihan's father, was poised to inherit, but he was not the warrior scholar his father had been. Known for his indulgences, Selim required strong ministers to steady the empire when his time came. This made Sokollu's presence more critical than ever. His marriage to Ismihan positioned him as the natural guardian of Selim's reign, the man who could guide the empire while her father sat on the throne. In the years that followed, Sokollu's responsibilities deepened. He became the linchpin between Süleyman's legacy and Selim's uncertain future. When Süleyman embarked on his final campaign in Hungary in 1566, it was Sokollu who carried the burden of leadership. And when Süleyman died at Sightvar, it was Sokollu who kept the secret, concealing the emperor's death for weeks until Selim could safely ascend the throne. It was an act of loyalty, of discipline, and of genius, but it was also a moment that revealed the true power of the marriage. For while Sokollu's silence preserved the empire, it also preserved Ismihan's father's claim. Without Sokollu, Selim might have faced chaos and rebellion. With Sokollu, the succession passed smoothly, and Ismihan became the daughter of a reigning sultan. From this point onward, their lives were inseparable from the destiny of the empire. Sokollu was elevated to Grand Vizier, the empire's highest office. Ismihan, as his wife and as the daughter of the sultan, became a figure whose very presence legitimized his authority. The outsider had become indispensable. The princess had chosen well. And yet, with their triumph came new dangers. Rival factions within the court resented Sokollu's unprecedented rise. Some whispered that he was too powerful, that he overshadowed the sultan himself. Others questioned whether the blood of an outsider could ever truly mix with that of the House of Osman. For Sokollu and Ismihan, every day became a balancing act. In private, they found moments of tenderness, moments where the weight of empire gave way to the simple bonds of husband and wife. In public, they were a power couple, carefully navigating the rivalries of ministers, the intrigues of the harem, and the expectations of a dynasty that demanded everything and forgave nothing. Their marriage, at once deeply personal and profoundly political, was a rare union in the Ottoman world. It was a union that embodied both the promise and the peril of the empire itself. The boy from Sokol, who had once been torn from his family, now sat at the right hand of the sultan, bound by love and blood to the dynasty that had taken him. The princess, who had grown up in the heart of empire, now shared her fate with a man whose very life was proof of the empire's paradox. That outsiders could be made insiders, that power could come from erasure, and that loyalty could sometimes demand the ultimate sacrifice. As the empire entered the reign of Selim II, Sokollu and Ismihan stood at its center. Their marriage was no longer a curiosity. It was the axis around which the empire turned. And as the storms of war, ambition, and betrayal gathered on the horizon, the question was no longer whether their bond would endure, but whether it could survive the weight of history itself. The summer of 1566 carried the scent of destiny across the plains of Hungary. Sultan Süleyman, the lawgiver, the magnificent, the man whose name had thundered across 3 continents, rode out for one final campaign. He was in his 70s, frail in body but still commanding in spirit. His army stretched endlessly, a river of men, banners, and cannons flowing toward the fortress of Cyprus. For decades, Europe had feared this march. Christendom had whispered his name with dread. Now at the twilight of his life, he sought one last conquest, a final assertion that the empire remained invincible under his gaze. But time was merciless. Beneath the gilded tent of the Sultan, illness gnawed at his body. The man who had once stood tall at the gates of Vienna now struggled to breathe, his strength slipping away like sand through an hourglass. As the walls of Cyprus burned under Ottoman cannon fire, the greatest ruler of the empire prepared to meet his end. On the night of September 6, 1566, Süleyman the Magnificent died in his tent. The empire's sun had set, but no trumpet of mourning was sounded, no black banner raised. The camp remained unaware. For one man, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, understood what was at stake. The army learned of Süleyman's death before victory was secured. Chaos would erupt. Soldiers might desert, commanders might plot, foreign enemies might exploit the moment. The fragile balance of succession, already fraught with danger, could collapse before Selim, the heir, even knew his father was gone. And so Sokollu did what only a man of steel discipline could do. He kept the greatest secret of his life. Süleyman's body was embalmed, hidden within the tent, guarded in silence. The empire continued its assault on Sigitvar as though its sovereign still breathed. Orders were issued in the Sultan's name, victories declared under his authority, and the machinery of war pressed forward, all while the lifeless body of its master lay shrouded in secrecy. It was an act both daring and terrifying. To conceal the death of a ruler was to play with fire, for discovery could mean not only disgrace, but death. Yet Sokollu understood that this silence was not betrayal. It was loyalty of the highest order. By keeping the secret, he preserved the empire's stability. By ensuring victory before revealing the truth, he guaranteed that Süleyman's reign would end not in weakness, but in triumph. When the fortress of Sigitvar finally fell, the Ottomans celebrated, unaware that their sultan had not lived to see the victory. Only then did Sokollu arrange for the transition of power. Messengers were dispatched to Selim, who awaited in Constantinople. By the time word spread, the succession was already in motion. The empire had been spared the chaos that might have torn it apart. For Ismihan Sultan, the death of her grandfather and the ascension of her father marked the most profound shift in her life. She was no longer merely a princess of promise. She was now the daughter of the reigning sultan, her status elevated to a position of unparalleled prestige. Yet she knew, as few did, that her father's throne had been secured not by his own strength, but by the resolve of her husband. Sokollu had not only protected the empire, he had protected her family. In that moment, their marriage ceased to be a symbol. It became the lifeline of a dynasty. Selim II, soon known as Selim the Sought by his critics, was a man of indulgence. Unlike his father, he had little taste for war or governance. He preferred wine, poetry, and the pleasures of the palace. For many, this might have spelled disaster. But for Sokollu, it was an opportunity. As Grand Vizier, he became the true architect of the empire's affairs, guiding its armies, managing its finances, negotiating with foreign powers. Selim sat on the throne, but it was Sokollu who carried the empire on his shoulders. Ismihan saw this clearly. She watched as her father leaned upon her husband, as Sokollu's influence grew to heights no vizier had ever known. Yet she also sensed the danger. For while Selim depended on Sokollu, others in the court whispered that the vizier had become too powerful. They spoke of him as the shadow behind the throne, the man who truly ruled. In a world where envy was sharper than any blade, such whispers could prove fatal. Within the harem, Ismihan navigated her own world of rivalries. As the daughter of the Sultan and the wife of the Grand Vizier, she stood in a unique position, straddling two spheres of influence. She was respected for her intelligence, admired for her poise, and envied for her marriage. But she was not immune to danger. The harem was a theater of intrigue, where alliances formed and dissolved overnight, where every gesture was scrutinized, every word weighed for hidden meaning. To survive here required the same discipline her husband displayed in the divan, and Ismihan possessed it. Together, they formed an extraordinary partnership. Sokollu, the outsider, wielded power through discipline, intellect, and political genius. Ismihan, the princess, legitimized his rule through her bloodline and reinforced his authority through her presence in the harem. They were two halves of a whole, navigating the perilous waters of empire with unity and resolve. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Sokollu's unprecedented authority bred resentment among rival viziers. His Balkan origins, once overlooked, were now used against him. Some argued that no man not born of Turkish blood should wield such power. Others feared that his influence over Selim was so great that the Sultan had become a puppet. Every success he achieved only sharpened the envy of his enemies. For Ismihan, this was both a triumph and a torment. She saw her husband rise higher than any man of his station had ever risen, yet she also saw the daggers being sharpened in the shadows. She knew that, in the Ottoman court, power was never secure, and love was never a shield. She had been raised to understand that dynasties devoured even their most loyal servants. But now, with her father on the throne and her husband at his side, she dared to hope that perhaps they could defy history. The years after Süleyman's death were years of paradox. Outwardly, the empire remained strong. Its armies still commanded vast territories, its wealth flowed from trade and conquest, its culture flourished in mosques, bridges, and schools. Sokollu oversaw projects that stretched the imagination, plans for a canal linking the Don and Volga rivers, dreams of opening a waterway through Suez to connect the Mediterranean with the Red Sea, restorations of churches and mosques alike. He was a man who thought not only of the present, but of centuries to come. But beneath this grandeur, the seeds of decline were sown. Selim's indulgence weakened the aura of the Sultanate. Rival factions gained strength. The Hürrem grew more influential, and enemies abroad sensed opportunity. Sokollu fought tirelessly to hold the empire together, but he could not fight alone. It was Ismihan who stood beside him, not on the battlefield or in the council chamber, but in the quiet moments where strategy gave way to fatigue, where ambition yielded to weariness. She was his confidant, the one who reminded him that his sacrifices were not in vain, the one who anchored him to the family that had once been taken from him. In her presence, he found not only legitimacy, but also the faint echo of the belonging he had lost as a child. And yet, history does not spare even its most devoted servants. Sokollu's silence at Sightvar had preserved the empire once, but silence could not forever protect him from the envy of rivals or the weight of destiny. The empire he had saved would one day turn upon him, just as it had turned upon so many before. For now, though, the bond between Sokollu and Ismihan stood firm, a union of discipline and bloodline, of ambition and legacy. The outsider had become the keeper of the empire's greatest secret. The princess had become the daughter of a reigning sultan. Together, they had carried the Ottoman dynasty across its most fragile transition. But as the years passed, and the shadows of new wars and betrayals lengthened, their story would enter a far more dangerous chapter. The death of Süleyman had been hidden to preserve the empire. The next deaths, however, could not be hidden. And in those moments, Sokollu and Ismihan would learn that sometimes even the strongest bridges cannot withstand the flood. The Mediterranean had always been a sea of collision, a restless stage where empires tested their strength against one another. By the 1570s, it was the hinge upon which the fate of Christendom and Islam seemed to turn. For centuries, Venetian galleys had carried the wealth of Europe through its waters, linking east to west, bringing silk, spice, and silver across horizons of sun and storm. Yet now the Ottoman Empire pressed harder than ever, determined to drive Venice from its strongholds, to claim the sea not only as a highway of trade, but as the living boundary of imperial power. At the center of this struggle stood Sokollu Mehmed Pasha. Grand Vizier, son-in-law to the Sultan, husband of Ismihan Sultan, he was no longer simply a servant of empire, he was its chief architect. And in 1570, when Selim II turned his attention to Cyprus, it was Sokollu who bore the responsibility for carrying out the conquest. Cyprus was not just another island. It was the jewel of Venetian holdings, a fertile land of vineyards, copper, and strategic harbors. Its position in the eastern Mediterranean made it a natural base for controlling sea lanes between Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. To Selim, indulgent yet ambitious, the conquest of Cyprus promised both prestige and pleasure. Legend claimed he longed for the island's wine above all. But to Sokollu, Cyprus was more than indulgence. It was a move to complete Ottoman dominance of the sea, to push Venice into retreat, and to anchor the empire's maritime frontier. The campaign began with thunder. Ottoman fleets poured across the sea, soldiers landed upon Cypriot shores, fortresses fell one after another. By 1571, the island was firmly within Ottoman grasp. The victory was celebrated in Constantinople with processions and rejoicing. Selim claimed triumph, but all knew the real architect was Sokollu. His vision had been realized. The empire's reach had grown, its prestige secured. But history is rarely content with triumph alone. For as Cyprus was won, a storm was gathering across the sea. Venice, humiliated but unbroken, forged an alliance with Spain, the papacy, and other Christian powers. It was called the Holy League, and it was not merely a coalition of states but of faiths, bound together by a shared desire to halt Ottoman expansion. At its head was Don John of Austria, the half-brother of King Philip II of Spain, a young and fiery commander determined to carve his name into history. In October 1571, the fleets of the Holy League and the Ottoman Empire met in the Gulf of Lepanto. What followed was one of the most brutal naval battles in history. The sea itself seemed to catch fire as thousands of men clashed, muskets cracking, cannons roaring, ships colliding in clouds of smoke and splintered wood. For hours the battle raged, and when the smoke cleared, the unthinkable had happened. The Ottoman fleet had been shattered. Over 200 galleys lost, tens of thousands dead or captured. It was a catastrophe unlike any the empire had faced in generations. News of Lepanto spread like wildfire. In Europe, bells rang in cathedrals. Sermons proclaimed divine deliverance. Paintings immortalized the moment. For the first time in living memory, the Ottoman navy had been dealt a decisive defeat. The myth of invincibility was broken. Across the Mediterranean, enemies whispered that the empire had begun to falter. For Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, the news was devastating. He had built his reputation on competence, on order, on the ability to steer the empire through storm after storm. Now the storm had struck, and his enemies within the court sharpened their whispers into daggers. Some claimed he had overreached, that his ambitions had drawn the empire into disaster. Others, resentful of his Balkan origins, muttered that an outsider could never truly guide the Ottoman destiny. The court was a furnace of envy, and Lepanto gave his rivals fuel. And yet Sokollu did not break. Where others saw catastrophe, he saw opportunity. Standing before Venetian ambassadors, he spoke words that became legend. "You have taken from us our beard, but we have cut off your arm. Our fleet is but a beard, easily grown again. Cyprus is our arm, and you shall not replace it." The metaphor was cutting, defiant. It declared that Cyprus, permanently secured, mattered far more than a lost fleet. Ships could be rebuilt in a year. An island, once taken, was forever. It was not bravado alone. Sokollu set to work immediately, orchestrating one of the most extraordinary feats of recovery in Ottoman history. Shipyards roared with activity, forests were felled, carpenters worked day and night. Within a single year, a new fleet of more than 200 galleys had risen from the slips, larger and stronger than the one that had been lost. By 1572, the Ottoman navy was once again a power to be reckoned with, and the Holy League, fractured by rivalries, began to dissolve. What had seemed like disaster had been transformed into resilience. Through it all, Ismihan Sultan stood at Sokollu's side. For her, the victory of Cyprus was a triumph of her father's reign, a jewel added to the empire's crown. But Lepanto struck at the heart of her husband's prestige. She witnessed the toll it took on him, the sleepless nights, the endless councils, the heavy burden of reputation. And yet she also saw the strength that defined him. Sokollu did not retreat into despair. He rebuilt not only ships but confidence, showing the world that the empire could endure loss and rise again. In their private life, the shadow of Lepanto deepened the bond between them. For Sokollu, Ismihan was more than a wife. She was the reminder that his legitimacy was real, that his place within the dynasty was not merely tolerated but anchored by love and blood. For Ismihan, Sokollu's resilience was proof that she had chosen well, that the outsider from Bosnia was not only worthy of her hand, but worthy of the empire itself. Together they endured the whispers, the resentments, the storms of politics. Together they stood as proof that defeat did not mean decline, that survival was its own form of victory. Yet beneath the surface, the Battle of Lepanto had changed everything. The Ottoman Empire was still powerful, still vast, but the illusion of unstoppable expansion had been pierced. Rivals abroad sensed vulnerability. Enemies within the palace grew bolder, watching for signs that Sokollu might stumble. The Grand Vizier had rebuilt the fleet, but he could not rebuild trust so easily. Each success he delivered was now measured against the memory of that single day of fire and blood on the Gulf of Lepanto. For Ismihan, the years after Lepanto were marked by a sharpened awareness of fragility. She had grown up believing in the permanence of the dynasty, in the inevitability of its triumphs. Now she understood that empires, like men, could bleed. She saw in her husband's eyes the weight of knowledge, that he carried not only the empire's fate, but also the memory of a childhood lost, a family erased, a future that might yet be stolen. And she feared, though she rarely spoke it, that one day the envy gathering around him would strike. as merciless as the Christian cannons had struck at Lepanto. Still, for the moment, they endured. Cyprus remained Ottoman. The fleet sailed again. The court bowed to Sokollu's authority. In public, he was unbreakable, the man who turned disaster into resilience. In private, he and Ismihan shared the quiet triumph of survival. The sea had burned, the fleet had drowned, but they remained. And in their endurance lay the hope that perhaps, against all odds, their bond could withstand the storms yet to come. In the years that followed the flames of Lepanto, the empire outwardly regained its composure. The shipyards had rebuilt the navy, the island of Cyprus remained Ottoman, and Sokollu Mehmed Pasha stood tall as Grand Vizier, unshaken in his authority. Yet in the silence between wars, Sokollu's mind did not rest. For some men, power was a prize to be enjoyed. For him, it was a burden that demanded vision. He did not think only of battles fought or victories claimed. He thought of centuries, of rivers and seas, of bridges that could outlast kings, of projects so vast that they seemed less like policies and more like dreams. It was in these years that Sokollu emerged not merely as a minister of state, but as a builder of worlds. His ambitions stretched beyond the horizons of his contemporaries, reaching for connections no Ottoman had ever dared to imagine. In his mind's eye, the empire was not a collection of provinces bound loosely by force, but a living body of trade, movement, and faith. To hold it together, one needed arteries, rivers, canals, bridges, caravan routes, that could carry life from one end to the other, and so he conceived projects that stunned his contemporaries. The first was in the north, where the empire brushed against the rising power of Muscovy. Sokollu envisioned a canal that would join the Don and Volga rivers, linking the Black Sea to the Caspian. Through it, Ottoman ships might sail into the very heart of Eurasia, projecting power into Persia, into Central Asia, pressing against the Russians who threatened from the steppes. In 1569, he attempted to realize this dream. Laborers dug, soldiers marched, ships were hauled across the land, yet nature and fate conspired against him. Floods, disease, and Russian resistance broke the project. The canal remained unbuilt. For others, it would have been an ending. For Sokollu, it was a lesson. Not all bridges can be built, but the vision of them remains, a reminder of what might yet be achieved. In the south, his imagination reached even further. Sokollu looked at the desert sands of Egypt and saw a possibility that would not become reality for centuries. A canal linking the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. The dream of Suez. To him, such a canal would do more than connect seas. It would alter the very balance of the world. The Ottomans could bypass Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean, channel spices and silks directly into their ports, dominate not only the Mediterranean, but the global trade routes. Surveyors were sent, plans were drawn. The desert yielded its secrets, but politics, money, and resistance held the project back. Like the Don-Volga Canal, the Suez remained a dream deferred. Yet in Sokollu's audacity, one glimpses a mind centuries ahead of its time. Ismihan watched her husband with a mixture of pride and unease. She admired his relentless drive, the way his thoughts spanned rivers and oceans. She knew that his vision elevated him above other men, that it was precisely this daring that made him indispensable. Yet she also knew the cost. Every failure, however inevitable, gave his enemies new whispers to spread. Every dream left unfulfilled became another reason to resent his reach. She loved him not only as her husband, but as the man who carried the empire itself in his thoughts. But she also feared that in reaching so far, he was placing himself in danger. For the higher the dream, the more devastating the fall. Not all of Sokollu's visions failed. Many became monuments that endure to this day. He built mosques and caravanserais, bridges and fountains. His name is etched in stone across the empire's heartlands, in Bosnia, in Anatolia, in the very capital of Constantinople. Perhaps the most enduring of his works is the bridge at Visegrad, arching gracefully across the Drina River in his native Bosnia. For the boy taken from his village, the bridge was more than stone. It was memory and legacy combined. It connected two shores, two worlds, just as his own life had bridged the gap between Christian childhood and Muslim empire, between outsider and insider, between servitude and power. The bridge was not simply for travelers of his day, it was for generations yet unborn, to remind them that from the most unlikely beginnings, greatness could rise. To Ismihan, these projects carried meaning beyond politics. She saw in them the reflection of her husband's soul, the yearning to build something that would endure beyond the fragile tides of court and sultan. In their private life, she would listen as he spoke of rivers, stones, and arches, as though the empire itself were a map etched into his heart. She understood, perhaps more than anyone, that these dreams were not indulgence, but necessity. For Sokollu, who had once been torn from his family and stripped of his past, legacy mattered more than power. Power was temporary, stone endured. Yet the palace was not built of stone alone. Within its marble walls, rivalries grew sharper. Sokollu's household, vast and disciplined, managed the machinery of state with efficiency that others envied. His ability to place allies in key positions, to control the flow of information, to dominate the council, all made him a target. Even as he built bridges for the empire, others dug trenches beneath him. The harem, where Ismihan navigated her own world of influence, grew restless. Murmurs that Sokollu had grown too powerful, that he overshadowed even her father Selim, spread like cracks through plaster. For Ismihan, this was the tightrope she had always known she must walk. She was daughter of a sultan and wife of a vizier. Her loyalty was divided. Her heart pulled between family and love, between blood and marriage. Yet she understood that without Sokollu, her father's reign would falter. She had seen firsthand how he preserved the empire at Shigitvar, how he turned disaster into triumph after Lepanto, how he dreamed for centuries ahead. In her eyes, he was not merely her husband, he was the empire's keeper. But even keepers are not safe. In the mid-1570s, as Selim II died and Murad III took the throne, the balance shifted. Sokollu remained Grand Vizier, still powerful, still commanding. Yet the new sultan was less pliant, more suspicious, more influenced by the harem. For Ismihan, the danger grew closer. She knew that with her father gone, her husband's enemies would grow bolder. She knew that every bridge built, every canal dreamed, every fleet rebuilt was not enough to protect him from envy sharpened into steel. Still, for a time, they endured. Their children grew. Their household thrived. Their names echoed through mosques and monuments. Together, they had bound the fate of an outsider and a princess into one story, a story that had carried the empire through storms and shadows. But as the years darkened, Ismihan could sense the approaching tragedy. She had been raised in a dynasty where power devoured even its most loyal servants. She had married a man whose brilliance could not be denied, but whose very success ensured enemies would never rest. The bridge at Visegrad rose from the Drina like a dream turned to stone, unyielding, graceful, eternal. Yet Ismihan knew that bridges, no matter how strong, could not protect against betrayal. Her husband had built connections across seas and rivers, but the most dangerous waters were within the palace itself, and in those waters, daggers waited beneath the surface. The empire had always demanded everything from its servants, but it rarely gave them peace in return. By the late 1570s, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha had been Grand Vizier for nearly a decade and a half, longer than most men could ever dream of surviving in that office. He had guided the empire through the death of Süleyman, preserved the throne for Selim II, steadied the realm after Lepanto, dreamed canals across continents, and raised bridges that still carried the weight of caravans and travelers. Yet the Ottoman court was not a place that tolerated permanence. To endure too long in power was itself a sin in the eyes of rivals. The very strength that had made Sokollu indispensable now made him intolerable. When Selim II died in 1574 and Murad III ascended the throne, the atmosphere shifted. Murad was young, deeply influenced by his mother Ismihan Sultan and the intrigues of the harem. Unlike his father, who had relied entirely on Sokollu's competence, Murad bristled under the shadow of a vizier who seemed to command more respect than the sultan himself. Sokollu, disciplined and cautious, knew this tension well. He had weathered the transition before, but he could sense that the walls were closing in. His enemies, long held at bay, now found fresh opportunities to whisper into the ear of a new ruler. Ismihan Sultan, caught between roles, understood the danger more clearly than anyone. She was no longer merely the daughter of Selim, but the daughter of a deceased sultan. Her influence diminished in the harem, where Murad's favorites now rose. Her husband remained Grand Vizier, still the empire's spine, but she could see the weariness in his eyes. He was surrounded by daggers dressed as courtiers, rivals who bowed in public yet plotted in private. She had grown up in the palace long enough to know how such stories ended. Still, Sokollu carried on. He attended to the machinery of empire, met ambassadors, signed decrees, reviewed accounts. His hand guided wars, treaties, and finances with the same discipline that had carried him from a boy in Bosnia to the empire's chief minister. Yet for all his control, he could not master the one force that haunted every vizier: envy. His origins, once celebrated as proof of the empire's merit, were now scorned. His power, once seen as salvation, was now feared as domination. He had built bridges across rivers, but he could not bridge the widening gulf between himself and the court he served. On the morning of October 11, 1579, Sokollu entered the imperial divan as he had done countless times before. The chamber was familiar, its walls lined with carpets and its air heavy with the scent of incense. But on that day, among the scribes and attendants, there appeared a man cloaked not in silk, but in the guise of sanctity, a dervish, or so he claimed. He approached with the serenity of a holy man, but within his robes was hidden steel. In a single shocking instant, the sanctity was revealed for what it was: a disguise for death. The dagger struck swiftly, bearing itself into the Grand Vizier. Sokollu staggered. The man who had carried empires now brought low by a blade wielded not by armies, not by rivals in open combat, but by an assassin's hand. The chamber erupted in chaos, attendants seizing the killer, cries echoing against the walls. But it was too late. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, the boy from Sokol who had risen higher than any outsider before him, collapsed upon the floor of the divan. His blood seeped into the carpets where he had once directed the affairs of continents. The news spread quickly through the palace, then across the city. Shock mingled with whispers. Some spoke of divine judgment, others of political conspiracy. Some claimed the assassin was a zealot, others that he was a pawn in a larger game, his hand guided by rivals who dared not strike openly. The truth was swallowed by silence, as truths so often are in courts where power demands discretion. For Ismihan Sultan, the news was shattering. She had shared her life with him not merely as a wife, but as a partner bound by empire. She had seen him rise from servant to sovereign in all but name, had stood beside him through wars and victories, through whispers and storms. Now he was gone, not felled in battle or undone by his own failings, but murdered in the very heart of the power he had preserved. She grieved not only for her husband, but for the empire itself, for she knew that in his absence, the stability he had held together would begin to unravel, and unravel it did. In the years that followed Sokollu's death, Murad III dismissed and replaced viziers with alarming frequency, the divan becoming a revolving door of ministers too weak or too ambitious to match the discipline of their predecessor. Corruption spread, factions hardened, and the stability that Sokollu had embodied was lost. The empire remained vast, but its machinery grew slower, its heart weaker. Historians would later look back and say that his death marked the end of an age of order, the beginning of decline. Yet Ismihan held on to his memory in another way. She looked at the mosques he had built, the caravanserais where travelers still found rest, the bridges that spanned rivers, carrying merchants and pilgrims alike. She saw in stone what he had always longed for: endurance. Power was fleeting, politics cruel, but stone remained. In the arches of the Visegrad Bridge, she could almost see him again, the boy taken from his village, the man who had bound himself to a dynasty through her, the husband whose dreams had reached across centuries. For the empire, Sokollu was a vizier, a servant, a master strategist. For Ismihan, he was more. He was proof that belonging could be forged, that love could be both political and personal, that even an outsider could become indispensable. She mourned him not as a symbol, but as a man, one who had carried burdens no one else could, one who had walked beside her through a world where few marriages were as consequential. The empire moved on, as empires always do. New viziers took his place, new wars were fought, new treaties signed. Murad III ruled, the harem whispered. The court conspired. Yet beneath it all lay a void that no one could fill. Sokollu's absence was not only the absence of a man, but the absence of discipline, vision, and resolve. The Ottoman Empire would endure for centuries yet, but never again would it be guided by a vizier so perfectly balanced between loyalty and ambition, between brilliance and restraint. And so his story closes not in triumph, but in paradox. The boy torn from his family became the empire's spine. The outsider became the husband of a princess. The vizier who preserved the empire through silence at Sigetvar, who rebuilt fleets after Lepanto, who dreamed canals and raised bridges, was struck down not by armies but by a dagger in his own council chamber. His wife, Ismihan Sultan, carried his memory, her own legacy bound to his, their union forever a bridge between blood and service, between dynasty and devotion. The camera of history pulls back to the Drina River once more. The bridge still stands, its arches reflecting in the dark waters, serene against the currents. Travelers cross it without knowing the story of the man who built it, or the woman who legitimized him with her name. Yet the stones whisper still. They whisper of a boy taken, a man remade, a marriage that bound him to empire, and a death that revealed the fragility of even the strongest. And as the sun sets over the bridge, the paradox lingers. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha is gone, assassinated in the heart of power, but his works endure, his memory entwined with that of Ismihan Sultan. In death as in life, he remains both outsider and insider, servant and master, forgotten child and immortal builder. The river flows on, but the bridge remains, daring us to remember that even in betrayal and blood, there can be legacy.